My name is Kimberly Braswell, and I'm the CEO and founder of Chemistry, which is a consulting firm that specializes in trauma-informed social justice. A lot of people ask me what that means, and I have historically been a diversity practitioner doing diversity, equity, and inclusion, but what I ended up finding out in doing work in a lot of different industries is that when you start drilling down into people's identities, especially when you're doing it through the lens of social justice work, which is a little bit different than doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you're doing that in a responsive way, what I started finding was identity has an inextricable link to people's stories, their traumas, their pain points. And so for me, that meant that I needed to do more than just create a program where it is generic, nothing against diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but for me, I needed to be responsive to the needs regarding disempowerment of people based on their identities. And so that led me to doing trauma-informed social justice work. What are our pain points in our stories, and how did that lead to us being disenfranchised from being able to have access to power, to privileges, to rights in order to make our lives a little bit better?
Kim, how do you identify those people? Because you and I have done some philanthropic work forever, and the one thing that I found is that there are a lot of people that's in financial trauma, mental health crises, but it's their norm, so they don't realize that it's actual trauma.
Right.
So how do you get them to see that this is a traumatic situation that you're in and you need help with this situation?
So what's interesting about that is a lot of my advocacy work deals a lot with definition. There's so much power in definition, and what I find is that people who have been disenfranchised or disempowered don't have access to being able to define their realities and their stories, right? So as an example, I'm a native of Columbus, Ohio. A lot of the communities that I'm from are considered to be communities who have experienced historic poverty. So Capitol Park, Agler Green, Linden, 22nd and Long, Rich in Ohio. What we didn't have language for in those communities was something like the word trauma. It didn't look like trauma for us, it looked like Wednesday, right? And so if we have normalized these experiences of extreme poverty, extreme violence, disempowerment, it doesn't look different. And so we don't feel like we have a right to see injustice in our story. Everybody knows someone who's gone through something as horrific or even more horrific than we do, right? So as an example, growing up, we all knew someone who was dead or in jail. We all knew someone who had been raped. We all knew someone who had grown up on food. So that wasn't a big deal. But when you compare that life in this zip code to the lives of many other people who are living better than this, right? We don't realize the disparate conditions that we're living in.
Sure.
So a lot of my advocacy work right now has looked at going into communities that normally aren't invited into having these kinds of conversations and giving them the definition. So guess what? What you're going through, this is not normal.
Sure.
And on top of that, let me give you this word trauma, which really just means a deeply distressing experience. And when we are thinking about trauma, especially if you've seen extreme conditions, you're viewing trauma as there was an explosion. No, trauma is you hungry and you can't do anything about it.
That's traumatic.
Trauma is there's no money coming. Trauma is we have diseases that we're going to die from, and we don't have access to medical care to treat these diseases.
Definitely.
Trauma is I've seen a dead body. Trauma is I got a parent who wasn't in my household because of the prison incarceration system.
Yeah.
These are traumas, and there are also other things that are what we conceive to be smaller, but they're not, because if it's a big deal, then it was big for me.
That's
so it's
right.
still a trauma, right? It's
Still
a
a
distressing experience. And so when we look at a lot of social justice work, we're also looking at trauma. And so for me, it was impossible to do this work and not have a trauma-informed approach to do it, so that I'm making sure not only am I going to fight and advocate for rights, but I need to make sure that I'm taking good care of you in the process of doing the work.
I definitely love that, and I appreciate that as well. Thank you for that explanation. You know what I also found in these communities? The women, they are do, serve, and they never seem to take any time to just breathe, to exhale. And so a lot of them serve, I think, as a supplement for self-care, or I don't know, help me with that.
Service is not self-care.
Yeah.
And I say this in a lot of my trainings and retreats and professional development sessions that I do for people. I think a lot of people, so this difference between our survival stories and our success stories. many of us, especially who have gone through traumatic experiences, we survived this thing. This horrific thing happened. Never want to go through that thing again, whether it was an isolated traumatic incident or whether it was what we call complex PTSD. This kind of trauma that I'm in an abusive relationship, and I'm in a household where I saw somebody abused. I'm in intergenerational poverty and I can't escape it. Once you finally escape from these things, or you move on from this thing, so now you're in healing, supposedly. Now you're in resilience if you do the work, right? But what ends up happening is for many people who have these stories and they've survived something like this, then they say, well, I went through this experience, it was major, I want to give back. I want to help other people who went through this thing.
Okay.
But you didn't do your work.
Yeah.
You're not okay. You just started serving people. So then what ends up happening, now we have other vocabulary words that we're not familiar with, like secondary trauma, right? So I'm not okay, but I'm going to do this work because I want to help all these people, prevent them from having the experience that I had, that I survived, or people who I loved. I wanted to prevent this from happening to them. But what ends up happening is I give, and I give, and I give, and I give. And two things. One is I'm doing all of this with no repository, right? I have nothing in me that's going to help supplement all the giving that I'm doing. And on top of that, I look like this fortress of strength and safety and security. So what ends up happening, the people who give the most, nobody's checking on them.
That's right.
Right? So if you look at a lot of powerful people, particularly powerful women of color, nobody's asking if we're okay.
Right.
So we just keep going until we burn out. Right, or literally die in some cases. And we can even see this there are research studies that show that women who, particularly successful women, strong women of color, go to the doctor, we are prescribed less medication. We're given lower doses of pain medication because we look like we have a higher tolerance for pain. So we're suffering more.
Wow.
Receiving less help, less support, and because we think we're supposed to just thug it out, especially if we've had those experiences, then that's what we do. And we do it until we get sick, and we do it until we die. And there's huge bodies of research that show, particularly for people who have experienced trauma by or before the age of 18, there are 10 particular items that they look at. This is from the study called the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences Study.
Wow.
10 particular items. Those who've experienced the tipping point is 4 or more are at risk of dying 20 years before someone with no childhood trauma. Now, how many people in disenfranchised communities have had child traumas, right? So the average number for poor communities, Black and brown communities, is 4. If you look at the causes of death for Black and brown communities, and you look at the causes of death for people who have experienced high levels of trauma, they are virtually the same. We are not well. We did not do the work to be well, and we just went out there and started serving. We need to make sure that we're okay and we're at our best so that we can do our best work, so that the help, the support that we give is sustainable. And we're out here and we're telling success stories, but we're not telling our survival stories.
Wow.
And sometimes people need your survival story. It's cool that I went to school and I got these degrees, and that's great. But if I'm helping someone who's in the midst of their trauma, you don't need to know, like, well, I got these pretty pieces of paper, and I have this job, and I have this car. I need to know how you got through the step that's after where I am, right?
I love that.
That's my survival story, and I need to get you there. That's true advocacy work, and I need to be well in order to be able to tell that story, because for some of us, when we didn't do the work, we're not healthy and whole enough to tell their survival story.
Yeah, and we may re-offend or re-traumatize. Though, you know, my mother, she was a victim of domestic violence. And I would tell I started studying at 15 years old because the police would come and they would ask my mother, well, what did you do to make him do that? So they would, in essence, re-victimize her.
Absolutely.
And so that was because a lot of them were abusive. I think at that time in Cleveland, it was 80. It was a huge number of the police force. 80% were perpetrators of domestic violence. And so they would, again, re-victimize my mother. And you're right, if we don't heal, if we don't come, that's in anything. If we don't come from a place of healing, we will re-traumatize or re-injure the person, because hurt people.
Exactly.
Not intentionally. But it's because we haven't taken the time to heal. So I see that perpetuated over and over in our society and in our community. So
we trigger people.
Yes, we will trigger people. Definitely. So give me a more in-depth or you just did. So we won't do that because I was gonna say, give me a more in depth definition or a kind of a contrast between surviving and succeeding. But I
Yeah.
think you kind of touched on it.
But I'll say this. My success story would be saying, when I went to college, coming from this background in poverty, like I've been a welfare baby since birth. Like the first place we lived was Capitol Park, right? The upgrade was Agler.
Okay.
So welfare baby the whole time, free and reduced lunch the whole time. When I went to college, my family was still on welfare. So this was the life.
Yeah.
But I graduated from college a year early. I got my master's degree in a year. Great
Wow.
success story. But the survival story is what I had to do to make sure that happened. Why did I graduate from college a year early? Well, because I went every summer. Why did I go every summer? Because I was trying to avoid my life of poverty that was waiting for me at home. So I stayed at school and I kept
That's
studying.
huge.
Like I was a survivor of sexual assault the summer before I went to college. I don't want to go back home.
Right.
So I'm going to stay in the school, but I don't tell that story, right? If I tell my success story, I graduated from college a year early, cum laude, involved student. It was a great time. I found myself. That's awesome. But you need to know how I also coped with poverty.
Yeah.
Surviving sexual assault. How I survived coming up in a household with a parent who had multiple mood disorders and mental health issues. That's my survival story, and that has everything to do with the moral imperative behind my work. And I think that I would not have gotten to the point of finding out my purpose, my calling, what I believe I was purposed to do for the world. You know, why I die empty every day, you know, knowing that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. That's not my success story.
Right.
That's my survival story.
Yes.
And this is the responsibility that I have to my community, to the people who are dead and in jail, to all the stories of the people in all of my neighborhoods who didn't make it. You know, the reason why the teachers say, well, I knew Kim was going to be okay. Why? It's this survival story. And so my responsibility when I go and do this work, I can put on the clicky shoes and the earrings and the whatever, and I get my hair cut, and that's great. But my survival story is my grit story, and that is being able to pull people to the side and say, I don't care about any of this stuff. Let me tell you why you're going to be okay. Because I've been here. I know what it's like to stand in that line. I know what it's like to be have food stamps, or have an EBT card, to have a whatever, have your electricity shut off. This is the advocacy work. And because you have that story, and because you are here, you have the ability to empower other people to change the whole community. You can change the whole world because you know what it's like, because you lived it and you walked it. That's the
awesome.
power.
That is awesome. So, I have chill bumps. I get them every time you speak, honestly. So powerful, so informative, so relevant. Makes good sense when you connect all of the dots. We try to compartmentalize this thing, but it's not. We can't. We shouldn't. We really try hard to, but we should not, because it really feeds one another.
We're whole
It
people.
fuels one another. We are definitely whole people. So if you would tell us how we can get in contact with you, or how the viewers can get in contact with you for more information, to become involved with you, to
Sure.
learn more about advocacy and how they can advocate for others, and about the healing piece, the wholeness piece.
Absolutely. So first thing, thank you to the community who has just been part of this story, this ongoing story. Thank you to ECDI, the great work that happens here, to people like you for giving opportunities. Appreciate you, love you. So I have my website, which is www.kimistry.net. I've done a couple of TEDx talks. Go support, watch the TEDx talks. My TEDx talks are about my survival stories.
Yes.
Right, so
They're
go
awesome.
check them out. One of them is called Crazy and Black and Poor, and one of them is called Over, Under, Around, and Through Trauma, where we talk about the stories, the secrets that we have in our families, and how do we get better in our families if we're not telling our stories. Social media, I'm on all the social media, and I use my whole life as part of my story. So I don't like to hide anything. You know, if it's encouragement, if it's a rough day, we talk about the whole thing. I have a blog, I have a YouTube channel, and I do a lot of community work. I do a lot of advocacy regarding restored citizens, immigration issues, poverty, a lot of race issues. So if there are topics that are compelling that we need to do more work on and we need to tell stories about, find me, let's tell the stories.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us, Kim, and we will definitely have you back again.